Hello everybody and welcome to my presentation. My name is Adam Farley and I plan to spend the next 5 minutes telling you all about Java exceptions. First of all, show of hands, who here has used Java before? All right. And how many of you have seen the code go horribly, horribly wrong? There we go. So I imagine a lot of you have seen some of these exceptions before, and if you haven't seen them, then you will soon. And I'd like to think that Java exceptions are useful to everybody. In fact, I know they're useful to everybody because when things fall down, they can be invaluable when it comes to figuring out what happened, why it happened, and how you can fix it in a minimum amount of time with a minimum amount of cost. Okay, so I'm hoping that some of the stuff that I'm going to teach you here today is going to increase your ability to go and do that as quickly and efficiently as possible. So we're going to start with the basics. We're going to start with checked versus unchecked. Now, the main difference between the two is whether or not the compiler cares. If you're trying to compile a bit of code that either produces an exception in itself or it tries to access a bit of code that generates an exception, then a checked exception, you have to check for it. You have to either explicitly handle it or you need to declare that your code could throw it in turn. An unchecked exception is the wild card. It's the kind of exception that your compiler is not going to warn you about in advance, and if your code sees it at runtime, it's just going to flop over, and it can very easily rise all the way to the top of your stack, cause your program to die. It's not always a bad thing, because diagnostic information is very useful, and sometimes it's just nice to see the world burn, you know? Right, we're going to start with an unchecked exception. We're going to keep it nice and easy. We're going to start with null pointer exceptions, that's NPE. Null pointer exceptions are pretty straightforward. You've got your objects in Java because it's an object-oriented language. And so you're going to take your objects and you're going to try using methods in them, you're going to try using variables in them, but none of that's going to work if you haven't initialized the object first. And if you haven't initialized an object or the reference to that object, then it is a null pointer because it's pointing to a null object. So as you can see here, I've tried to use an object that hasn't been initialized. It's all gone terribly wrong, and Java's told me, no, this isn't going to work. Go home and do it again. Maybe not in that order. Okay, now the technique I like to use is the sweep. We start at the bottom, and we move up the stack trace until we get to the last bit of code that I've written. And in this instance, it's lemon.java, because I'm not very creative when it comes to class names. And so what we do is we come up to the last thing I wrote, we get the name of the class at the end, the line that it's broken on, and usually what we've done here is we've tried to throw a non-initialized object at a library class, and that's caused that to fall over. So we just put in a null check, or you just review your code by hand, and it's usually pretty straightforward what's gone wrong. And if it's not, then ask somebody else. Here we have the index out of bounds exception. This is another unchecked exception type. It's also known as the array index out of bounds exception. The reason it's called that is because here I've tried to use an array. In this instance, it's array list because I like them. And we've got the array of size 1, and I've tried to access the index number 2, which doesn't exist, so we got an exception. Again, we sweep up from the bottom, we find my line of code, my class, and then we just go there, figure out what's gone wrong. Okay? And here we go, here's a checked exception, and the reason that's gotten to the top of the stack, by the way, is because we've wrapped it in an unchecked exception. That's kind of sneaky, but, you know, get anything for a good example. And here's the class not found exception, no such class. I've misspelled a class name, and as such, you're just checking your input, your code, sorry, for typos, that sort of thing. And typos in the name of the class. And that's it. thank you for listening, and I hope you've learned something about exceptions.